Okay, we're gonna go through a little quick map run of a Chimera map. The relevant mods here are extra fire and cold, monsters poison on hit, but I can't be poisoned because of my Pantheon power, and then extra life and AoE on the boss. So just to showcase what this guy is like in action a little bit. He's a character that has a lot of physical damage reduction, so he'll probably see some health chunks a little more than normal because of the extra fire and cold damage, but still should be fine, I think. So, although this is a Berserker build, it's actually pretty damn tanky. As I said, I've spec'd quite a bit of physical damage reduction as well. I have a very low cooldown on my war cries, and as you may know, with the Berserker Ascendancy, you get 25% of your HP back every single time you war cry, and I can do that in about every 1.4 seconds. So, as a result, Corrupting Blood is rough on this map with the extra fire and cold. But as a result, you get an absolutely massive amount of sustain from that. As well, there's Leech and tons of regen to counter the Rage degen that they have. So, it is overall a pretty standard melee playstyle in that you are gonna, shield charge or comp path in, proc your Fortify, pop your flasks, all that stuff. One thing I would say that's different, though, is the buff management is a little bit more heavy because of the need to use war cries properly. So you actually don't generally want to war cry immediately upon getting into a pack, unless you're pretty sure you're just going to one-shot it and it's not going to continue, but you actually want to use it as a quick burst of heal. Even though you're using Tectonic Slam, because you have a Warlord's Mark Blasphemy Curse and the Synthesized Chest mod that gives you extra endurance charges, you actually do a pretty good job of keeping your endurance charges up, despite the fact that you might pop your war cry before you actually expend any charges, but it's not really that big of a deal. I think it's much more important to have the on-tap heal than occasionally lose a charge. But you can see it's pretty darn tanky. You can mostly just wildly leap into packs. The only time my health has really gone down is when hit with a ton of stacks of Corrupting Blood. And even with all that extra LE damage, you can just tank Chimera, no problem. Damage is really good here. And you actually stun stuff a lot as well, which is nice. You get a bit of another sort of extra layer of defense with all the CC. So I usually pop my pox there for the unique ad. So, as stated, even with a couple of damage mods here, it's pretty darn tanky. Can definitely handle a few hits. So, as I generally try to do with my builds, it's kind of a nice mix of decent clear and single target, I think. It's not insane at either one, but it can do both pretty competently. And I would prefer to be able to do a mix of content, but, some people like to specialize. So if you're looking for kind of a specialty character, this is probably not the one for you. The totem itself does quite a bit of damage too, which is pretty nice. You see the extra cold damage actually got chilled there a little bit, because I'm not popping my pots for the smaller ads there. So, pretty easy. You know, solid single target, clear, pretty tanky, good movement speed and mobility. So, I think a pretty well-rounded character. Basically tackle any content in the game. Let's go through the gear here for my 3.6 Tectonic Slam Berserker. This is a facebreaker build, so we do not have a man-hand weapon. We used unarmed attacks. One of the main ways that you scale unarmed attack damage is through adding flat physical damage on your gear. Because unarmed attacks have such a low base to their physical damage, however, it is all added at up to 9 times normal effectiveness, so you get a lot of bang for your buck for every bit of flat physical damage that you add. Which brings in the Circle of Guilt rings. Added this league in Synthesis. There's this whole group of rings that all augment the different heralds, and in this case, this augments Herald of Purity, which was already very good for facebreaker builds. Now you can get a Herald of Purity that gives you basically triple the buff effect, because you can get up to 100% increased buff effect on each of these rings for a total of 200% increased buff effect plus the base. As well, these guys add flat physical damage on their own. All attributes is very useful for this. Armor is very useful for this, and you can even get some life on the implicit. For the second random mod, which you can get, I recommend physical damage reduction. It stacks very well with all the other sources of physical damage reduction we have: endurance charges, oak passive, all the armor that we run, etc. However, you can also get increased physical damage if you just want more damage. I prefer the tankiness. As well, one of the new Synthesis implicits that also was partly inspirational for this build is the gain endurance charge, an endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently mod from the Jug Ascendancy. Really helps us keep our endurance charges topped off. We literally never run out at all, and in fact generally never go below 5 endurance charges. So in addition to helping us stay topped off pretty much all by itself, it also allows us to use our war cries reactively to burst damage, since they offer a burst heal, and really increases our survivability that way, in addition to just keeping our endurance charge number quite a bit higher at all times. As well, now because the last time I made one of these builds, I ran dual Razor of the Seventh Sun. Now we get to use a shield. Red Blade Banner is super duper good on this build because of all the extra cooldown recovery speed you get on your war cries, which means more endurance charge generation, and it also means more of the on-tap heal. As well, the attack damage leeches life against taunted enemies mod is useful for hex-proof maps, since we mostly rely on Warlord's Mark Blasphemy Curse. So, with this, in combination with the nodes on the tree and your Ascendancy nodes for war cries, Enduring Cry has a 1.43 second cooldown and lasts for over 2.5 seconds. So, as a result, you can actually easily alternate between this and Rallying Cry for a pretty massive damage buff. And as well, with a cooldown this low, you effectively get something like 17% HP more per second in perfect circumstances. Obviously, that's not going to happen most of the time, nor is it necessary most of the time. But in theory, you get a lot of sustain, unconditional sustain out of it. So, another important piece here is the helmet. I was running a Dyed Bellow, which has a bunch of flat physical damage, a massive buff every time you war cry. It essentially gives you a second onslaught, but the drawback of not being able to leech well on low life is really rough. I actually barely died with it anyway. I think I only died like a couple times to some Synthesis bosses whose mechanics I was unfamiliar with. But I had the bright idea to try and replace it, and came up with the idea that you can get socketed plus level of socketed minion gems on your helm. Well, Herald of Purity is a minion gem, and you can get up to +3, but as you can see, this is a pretty damn good helmet. So once the idea came to me, I actually just poked around on PoE Trade and got really lucky and snagged this guy for 2x. but it has the most relevant mods for damage, which are the +2 level of socketed minion gems, as I mentioned, and nearby enemies have minus fire resistance as well. I was lucky enough that this had a Tech Slam enchant on it, which is insane. Thankfully, nobody is playing Melee this league, so it was a lot cheaper than it probably would have been. But anyway, the point is that these mods really actually can give you a damage boost almost at the level of what Dyed Bellow provides, but while being a lot more survivable. Our amulet, we're running a Zoph's Blood, get the full fire conversion this way. Can't use the gloves because we're using Facebreaker, so we needed it a different way. You can path to Avatar of Fire on the tree, but you're going to have to sacrifice some other life or damage nodes or something in order to do that. And this is just a damn good amulet anyway. It gives us a lot of stats that we want. Boots, another rare piece here where we can just get the resistances and such that we need. You basically have your chest, your helm, your boots, and this guy, and then jewels and stuff in order to get your resists, since you are wearing 5 pieces of what I feel are essential unique gear. I would say that this is probably the best enchant to get on your boots as well, though there's a couple others, like the Elemental Penetration one is pretty good too. Same thing we're looking for on our Stygian Vice. Basically, we're just looking to get, life and resists and stuff. If you can manage to get the resists you need and still have room left over for damage mods, then you can get increased elemental damage with attacks, or increased fire damage would all work as well. Then we have our jewels. Jewels are pretty important for a Facebreaker build because you can just add flat physical damage with Abyssal Jewels, so you just want life and flat physical damage, and then some other mod that is just useful to you in some way. Attack speed is good, armor is good, resistances are good. I also grab base stats like strength on them as well. If you cannot afford a bunch of good Abyssal Jewels, you can also get regular jewels with double attack speed rolls and increased life or something like that would also work. For our flasks, we run a bleed flask in the first slot here. Onslaught flask, need that freeze and chill immunity, way too important on a build like this. Any melee build, really. Wise Oak, you get the pen and you can get the damage reduction. I was fortunate enough to actually triple balance mine through some divining, and just a funny story, I actually traded somebody a 39% fire resistant Zoph's Blood for a 38 because I was one fire res off perfectly balancing them, so I just messaged him and asked him if he would trade because I was trying to balance my Wise Oak, so he got a free upgrade on his Zoph's Blood. And then Lion's Roar here, just too much damage to give up, and actually the knockback effect is not super annoying on this build because our attack speed is not super high. It's high enough that, I think it feels fine and smooth, but it's not so high that it just, like with certain fast attacking multi-strike builds or something, that it just really pushes enemies back in a really obnoxious, prohibitive way. And then I use a Quicksilver with Curse Immunity on it. I think Quicksilvers are great on this build because it, since we're using Shield Charge, it also helps the movement skill itself. Let's review the skill rollout here for our Berserker, Tectonic Slam being the main skill. Supports for the main skill are Elemental Damage with attacks, Elemental Focus, Melee Physical Damage, Added Fire, and Ruthless. Ruthless is definitely interchangeable with Fire Penetration. It is a little bit less damage over time to run Fire Penetration, but you do have more consistent damage output. I find it doesn't matter, you one-shot trash anyway, and the extra utility of the increased base stun duration from Ruthless procs is really nice when fighting tankier rares or unique map bosses and stuff like that, especially since it synergizes with the reduced enemy stun threshold here, the fact that we run Warlord's Mark, which gives some benefits to stun, and the fact that the Facebreaker Tech Slam setup is just kind of a slower hitting but harder hitting build in the first place. We do run Veil Ancestral Warchief. We link that with Combustion for a little extra fire resistance reduction that does augment our main skill. Added fire damage and elemental damage with attacks. These are just the highest damage supports. Since we are running Avatar of Fire and only half of the damage of the Warchief's attack gets converted to fire damage and the rest is largely wasted, added fire damage just kind of increases the base damage of the totem significantly. So it actually is probably the highest damage support. Then we run both Shield Charge and Consecrated Path with your typical faster attacks. Fortify setup. I think Consecrated Path is really, really nice in this build. It allows us to cross gaps, though it is a conditional thing to cross gaps because you do need an enemy to get to, but as well it makes us reliably proc fortify against bosses, and we also can tank bosses a little bit better when we're standing on consecrated ground. We have our War Cry set up, so Enduring Cry and Rallying Cry both linked to Increased Duration. Increased Duration is actually pretty noticeable with both of these. You have to cast Rallying Cry less often to keep the buff up permanently, and it really pushes Enduring Cry into sort of comfortable, non-clunky territory in terms of its duration. Rallying Cry is, Enduring Cry I think is pretty obvious why we run it, right? The Endurance Charge generation is super powerful, and actually the regen effect is also excellent, especially the way that we tend to use War Cries, which is in response to incoming burst damage. But Rallying Cry is also excellent. You get a pretty massive damage increase when you cast this on like high density maps that have lots of sextants and pack size and stuff like that. Then we have our aura setup, which is Blasphemy linked to Warlord's Mark. Warlord's Mark is definitely the curse to run on this build, and I think you want it up reliably, and you can't really sacrifice one of these rings for a Warlord's Mark on hit ring. They just offer too much damage. They're too core to the build. So anyway, the life and mana leech are great, the endurance charge generation is great, and then the extra stunning of enemies is actually pretty noticeable. Then we run Herald of Ash and Herald of Purity. Herald of Ash, although it does add a significant amount of damage to the attack itself, it's really more for the clear benefits. And then Herald of Purity is just pretty core to any Facebreaker build, as I kind of went over in the previous video there, the gear video. The amount of base physical damage that it adds to your attacks is just too much to pass up. Let's go through the passive skill tree here for my Tectonic Slam Berserker. So I have prepared two leveling trees, one which represents where you want to be at about level 50, assuming you have killed Act 5 Kitava at that point, and then at level 70, assuming that you have killed Act 10 Kitava. These trees also assume that you want to switch to Tectonic Slam as soon as you can. You may want to run a different route on the passive skill tree if you are doing a different leveling spec. So with that said, Resolute Technique is the first thing that I recommend you rush your way toward. Your attack speed and your accuracy are awful early, and as a result, this is both a massive damage boost and massive quality of life boost. Highly recommend making your way there ASAP. As well, the next things that you want to grab are resistances here. You could even grab these basically right away, early on, kind of slightly delaying your rush to Resolute Technique, that's fine. And then making your way up into the Templar starting area and grabbing this node here, and then since you're 1 point away, this is too efficient not to grab. Those provide some base stats as well, which are nice. And then these nodes here also give you some resistances, so by the time you have grabbed Diamond Skin, Holy Dominion, and Barbarism, your resistances should be looking pretty decent. Also, by the time you reach that point, you will have gone through Act 2, and I do suggest taking the Oak Bandit reward. A lot of people will probably laugh at that and say, why would you not take the 2 passive points? But 1% life regen is very, very good, especially on a character like this who has a massive degen due to the rage stacks that you get. The physical damage reduction is more relevant on this character than most because you do stack actually quite a bit of physical damage reduction overall. And then, of course, some damage as well. Next thing that I recommend doing is going up and grabbing these endurance charges here, and then down and grabbing these endurance charges here. I do suggest grabbing these first just because the duration will improve quality of life in terms of keeping your endurance charges up quite a bit. As well, the Warbringer node here is what you're going to take when you do your first lab and grab your first couple ascendancy points. So once you have this and these endurance charge nodes, then Tectonic Slam should start to feel pretty decent, especially if you have turned on your Warlord's Mark of Blasphemy Curse by that point, which is about when you do. And finally, kind of the last moving pieces that really smooth out the whole Tectonic Slam Warcry setup is when you grab these Warcry nodes here and here, especially these that make the Warcries instant. At that point, it's going to start to have a much smoother playstyle. I also just sort of assumed that you will need these base stat nodes for faster attack support and for the blasphemy support. You do also have the flexibility of going up and grabbing this node and the smaller one leading up to it that gives you some resistances to help you cap your resists along the way if the other ones that I mentioned are not enough. So then we have our level 70 tree here, again assuming you've killed Act 10 Tava and got all the passive points along the way. So it's kind of your entry level mapping setup. So what are the things that I then prioritize? Well, first of all, for your second and third labs, you'll be grabbing Crave the Slaughter and Rite of Ruin. So because by the time you get to Rite of Ruin, you are going to have a pretty nasty degen on you, I do focus on getting to the life regeneration nodes by the time I get to level 70. So combat stamina and Golem's Blood here both provide some additional life regeneration in addition to the ones you've already grabbed here, here, the Oak Reward, etc. to just make things feel a lot more comfortable. Definitely want to grab the next endurance charge pretty quickly too. You just grab that as you are pathing your way over to Golem's Blood. And finally, we are starting to grab some damage nodes. So Divine Fury here is just too efficient not to grab, and these are also great. They offer offensive, defensive, and sort of quality of life smoothness bonuses, since they do provide some attack speed. As well, we get Constitution because it's just too efficient not to take. Probably the least important thing, but you will want to take it by the time you get to mapping, is Amplify. You could take it a little sooner if you want to, but the pack sizes start to get significantly bigger once you enter mapping, though, you know, it's your preference and you may want to grab it a little bit sooner than that. Okay, let's go ahead and review the passive skill tree as it appears currently on my level 95 Berserker. So if you'll notice on this tree, compared to the level 71 that I showed you before, there's not a lot of extra damage nodes that I take. Mostly that's because by the time you finish your 4th lab and get Aspect of Carnage, which is 40% more damage, unconditional, you really don't feel like you need very much more. So, as a result, the only 2 pure damage nodes I take are actually going up here to Divine Wrath. You may ask, why don't I take Lava Lash? Well, the fire damage penetration does not work with unarmed attacks. It specifically says weapons, and as a result, these nodes are just not super efficient. The only other damage nodes I take are a combination of both damage and life or some other survivability. So you get those in the form of the jewel nodes, here, here, and here. And then actually, I take Rampart, which gives you extra armor, extra effective fortify, and a bit of damage as well. I think that Rampart is especially effective on this character. I do have extra damage reductions from the triple balanced Wise Oak that I'm running, and also from all the percent physical damage reduction I get from endurance charges, from my Circle of Guild rings, some other incidental percent damage reduction, physical damage reduction, and the fortify buff itself. So the way that all those damage reductions stack means that the extra few percent damage reduction you get from fortify, really you get a lot of effectiveness out of them. And then finally, I take some additional life nodes that offer quality of life. Tireless here, the reduced mana cost of skills. You do sacrifice a tiny little bit of life to do this, but I do think it is worth it. And then just simply pad life where the efficient little nodes are. You could also pick these guys up if you really wanted. Finally, I do take Indomitable. I think the reduced extra damage from critical strikes is super important on this character. You are low evasion, though technically you're not unwavering stance, so not as bad as some. But between the low evasion and the fact that you do take 10% increased damage because of this node, crits can be especially nasty. So as a result, I think that this is essential to keeping yourself survivable. Not to mention that in theory it should give you reduced extra damage from critical strikes from elemental damage, so which is something that is a little lacking on this character aside from the Wise Oak. So what are some other points you could conceivably take if you want to adjust things to personal preference? If you find the attack speed on this character too slow, which I don't, it's one of the reasons I like Berserker is you get so much attack speed out of it. You really don't have to spec a ton. You do get a little bit from these shield nodes, but you could definitely make your way to Berserking. It is not as efficient in terms of the number of points that you're investing and the return on those points compared to the ones that I have taken, but it is certainly reasonable to take them, sacrifice a little damage for improvement in quality of life. If you have insane jewel nodes, you certainly could take some of these 3-point jewel nodes. I don't think you're going to find it to be worth it though, because the Circle of Guild rings just offer so much flat physical damage that the damage boost you get from them is not as insane as it is for some Facebreaker builds. The other thing you could do is you could make your way over here. If I were to gain another level, I would probably unspec these 2 points and go through here instead. Or if I were to get the dex that I need, which is unlikely, I'm probably pretty set in terms of the gear I have, but if I were to get the dex I needed, I could also unspec and get there and then unspec these 2 points, but we're really grasping at straws at this point, and it's not necessary. The damage is quite good on this character as is. This node is pretty decent, actually. Some people might laugh at that, but I think it's totally decent on this character. And if you're really desperate for resistances, you could go up into these shield nodes right here, but I don't recommend it. Try and just use these nodes to help you cap resistances if you're really struggling on those. Aside from that, I can't think of anything that's a real contender for efficient good points to grab. Maybe if you don't have a Zoph's Blood, you go up here and you get these along the way instead of some of the little nodes. But assuming that you have the gear that you need, I can't think of any other points that you'd really want to take besides what I have spec'd here.